Stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker of Elkins Consulting.
When we share stories, whether in our personal or business lives, how we share them makes a difference in how we remember them and in how we're perceived by the people we're sharing them with. When you're listening to this podcast, I encourage you to listen and consider your own related stories. To listen and think about which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. And think about how you share those stories and the messages they carry for you and for the people who are hearing them.
Another wonderful small world story brings me to my guest today. Monica is somebody that was introduced to me via her book that she published recently. One of my dear friends that I met on LinkedIn probably 7 or 8 years ago, Andy Hedges, lives near Sydney in Australia. And he sent me a Facebook Messenger link to Monica's book. And it's called The Change Code. So, of course, as soon as I read it, a lot of it really resonated with me. So I had to reach out and see if maybe she would be interested in being interviewed on my podcast. And she very graciously agreed. But as soon as she said yes, because I had found her on LinkedIn, I started digging into her profile. And it turns out that she grew up in Montana, not far from where I was just visiting over the weekend for a conference that I was speaking at. So, Monica, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Sarah. I'm really excited to be here.
It's so funny that it was Andy Hedges that introduced us via your book. And I know you're connected with him on LinkedIn, but I don't know how well you know him. But I was just saying how small a world it is because a few years back, my friend Hannah Bratterud, who lives in Bozeman, was introduced to me via a woman in Coffs Harbour, Australia, which is just north of Sydney. When Hannah moved to Bozeman from Denver, she was talking to Anna McAfee on LinkedIn and said, "Hey, I just moved to Montana." And Anna said, "Well, I only know one person from Montana and you should meet her." And we've been friends ever since.
That's awesome. I love those stories because it does show just how small the world is and how we're much more interconnected than we realize sometimes.
Absolutely. I think that 6 degrees of separation is actually smaller now, which makes me happy because I love those stories. So I always start by, I know we're going to get into some great conversations about your book, The Change Code, and how you came to learn about the researchers that created that spiral, what is it called?
Spiral dynamics.
Spiral dynamics in the context of the self-actualization and development of humanity, really. So I'd like to start by asking you to share something about yourself that most people wouldn't know. And the reason I ask this question is because I like our audience to have a little bit of context about who you are before we start diving into what you do and your stories.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm sure there's lots of things, but I think one thing that's a little bit interesting about me is that I've had a broad range of jobs over my lifetime. Even though I've been in the corporate world for more than 20 years, I've also done a lot of things kind of before that and also on the side. You know, for instance, I worked for a private investigator in Denver for a while. I sold encyclopedias and actually was really successful. It was kind of before the internet was big. I've been a waitress, just done a wide range of things. And I think that has really given me a broad perspective and a broad skill set. So,
yes, I love that you just said that. I think too many of us don't end up exploring a lot of different opportunities in the workforce. And what you're describing really gives you perspective, not just about jobs and work, but the communities, the populations that you interacted with and served in all of those different roles. Really, I can understand now as I think about the book that I just read that you wrote, I can understand now even more how you could present it without judgment.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I definitely think those experiences benefited me. You know, I feel like I'm one of those people who's passionate about a lot of different things. And depending on how you look at it, it can be, you know, kind of jack of all trades, master of none. But I tend to look at it in a more positive light now that I'm a little bit older and realizing that I have a broad width of knowledge.
Right, right. I just had some conversations with people about that. My friend Wendy Blackwood calls it a gypsy careerist.
Yes.
And I agree. And I used to play it down, and when I was in my 30s and early 40s, I would play it down because I thought that it looked bad that I moved around so much. But now, as you said, and I see other people with this background, and I actually have so much admiration and respect for people who have tried a lot of different things before they found something that they really found satisfying and rewarding.
Yeah, I think it definitely helps you get comfortable with change and, just being able to do different things. So, yeah.
Yes, completely agree. So, Monica, can you tell us a little bit about what you do now within the healthcare industry?
Yeah, so I currently have a full-time day job in the corporate world, and I've actually been in the healthcare corporate world for over 20 years. So I've had a lot of stability as well. But within that, I've done a broad range of tasks. I've always been the person in the organization that gets assigned, special projects around innovation or change, or so I kind of have, even though I've had a lot of stability, I've had a lot of different experiences in that corporate world. So I currently do business development in the corporate world in healthcare, which I enjoy very much. And then I also have a business coaching and consulting business where I work with people who are change agents and who are trying to make a difference, especially in the healthcare world. But not necessarily working within the system, maybe that want to create something new outside of the system or go around a lot of the barriers that we see in the current healthcare system.
Wow. Boy, this is timely, isn't it? Not just because healthcare is in such terrible flux right now, very difficult situations right now, but also with, as you know, it has to be said today, right? The whole coronavirus and pandemics and things that are going to hit our global economy and communities more and more as we are more and more interconnected.
Absolutely. And I think that, while the coronavirus is a significant challenge for us, it's helping us to realize that it's not just countries, that we're all connected around the world, and that there are these big, massive problems. In the book, I refer to them as wicked problems that no one person or single solution is going to be able to solve. And so I think this is an example of one of those wicked problems that we're really going to have to work together and come together really as humanity and as a planet to begin to solve some of these problems. We're not going to be able to stay so divided in the future.
Right. Absolutely. One of the things that your book did for me, I know that there are only a couple of references to Maslow's hierarchy because it really is, there is some foundational information or structure there, but it's not Maslow's hierarchy because it isn't a hierarchy. It's more of a swell. And I like the image that you included in that. But one of the things, even before I finished it, I was probably only about a third of the way into the book when I saw back and forth interesting conversation, which was very respectful, but definitely a little heated, was about the environment and about global climate change. And no matter how much data and science you put in front of people, they're not going to change their minds. And but it was really an interesting back and forth. But what I realized is that I wanted to inject something into that conversation. I was compelled. Many times I'll just ignore it because it's not helping anybody. Nobody's changing anyone's mind. They're just basically agreeing to disagree. And that doesn't actually move us forward. It helps us to understand each other and create kindness and compassion toward other people's thinking, but it doesn't move us forward. Right. And so I felt compelled to interject, and maybe it was because I had read through the first third or so of the book. But what I put in there was, let's change the conversation. Let's not argue about the science. Right. Let's just not argue about the science, because whether you believe it doesn't matter. Let's start talking about the solutions to our plastics problem. because we all know that the packaging that we see, that we receive in our homes, you've seen images of the ocean being covered, and you know that those plastics are heating the temperature of the ocean. You know that that's the case. You can't not know that. So let's talk about that problem, because we all can agree that that's a problem that needs a solution.
Right. I think that was a great approach. I actually had a similar conversation with a dear friend of mine that I've known for a number of years about climate change. And she did an early preview of my book, and she came back to me and she said, Monica, I was really offended that you chose to use the term climate change. And so we got into a discussion about that. And, her belief system is that climate change is a lot of the, negative in the media, and that it's politicized and that sort of thing. And so, we had this conversation, and what we realized is that we actually had a lot in common, because when you start looking at, okay, within that, the plastics problem, the issues with wildlife and our overconsumption of goods, we agree about all of those things and are very much aligned. It's when you politicize the issue, it creates a lot of tension.
Exactly. So I really appreciated that. So now let's go backward in time a little bit. And you mentioned in the book how you discovered this work, but I'm curious about why you were looking for it in the first place.
Yeah, great question. So, I've always been someone who feels like they need to help make a positive difference in the world. And so I kind of started on this journey, not really knowing what that would look like. And I started blogging back in probably 2011, kind of the early days of blogging. And then in 2014, I published an article on Huffington Post called 7 Ways to Change the World. And actually, I just got tagged yesterday in this post again. I just have gotten messages, this was in 2014, and I still get correspondence from people all over the world who say that it really inspired them, and it gets cited quite often. I got featured in a textbook. And so it felt like probably one of the most authentic things that I had written up to date. And so I realized that there was a real place for a simple, kind of inspiring message that also calls people to action. And of course, wanting to make a difference, I really want to see people start to take charge and start to take action and to make things better. And so I decided to write a book at the end of 2018 and just started researching. And I really believe that once you kind of make a commitment to doing something and fully step into it, things conspire to help you make that happen. Mm-hmm. And that was definitely the case. I hadn't been going to my previous church, and my daughter actually said, we need to go this Sunday. And I was sitting there and they announced this class on spiral dynamics. And I had never heard of it, but I thought, gosh, that sounds like it might be good research for my book and really interesting. And so I went to the first class, and this was a 6-week class that I committed to doing, which is kind of out of character for me because I already have a pretty busy schedule. But they had piqued my interest enough. But as soon as I got to the class, it just really blew my mind, because it put a lot of things into perspective about why there's so much polarization in the world today, and why people just have such different perspectives, and how it's challenging to bring them together. So it helped put context around that. But I think more importantly, it gave me a lot of optimism for the future. And so I knew immediately that needed to be the underlying framework for my book. And so, I continued the class, and then just immersed myself in research around spiral dynamics. In fact, even reaching out to one of the pioneers in spiral dynamics, Dr. Don Beck, and I made 4 trips to Dallas, Texas to meet with him, and had multiple conversations on the phone. And so, really just lived and breathed this theory for many, many hours.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So I'm imagining I'm imagining you choosing to write a book. Do you remember kind of the trigger that you realized? Was it because you heard from somebody about your article? Did somebody say something about your article and you just kind of had that light bulb moment?
Yeah, and I think I have wanted to write a book for a while, and it kind of just all came to me at once. It's like, your daughter is grown and out of the house, and it's a really good time for diving into some type of creative endeavor. And so, the timing just was right for me, and so I made that commitment to kind of step into it, not really knowing what I was getting myself into.
Had you started writing or outlining before you went to that spiral dynamics first session at the church?
I had, and it was very similar to the article that I had written. And so I was going to highlight easy ways, to make a difference in the world, and inspirational stories about people who had done that sort of thing. But what was really bothering me also was polarization, because I felt like until we're able to kind of address some of the issues with polarization, it's going to be hard to work together to solve any of these bigger issues, because we can't even have simple conversations. And so to me, that felt like a real starting point, is we need to understand polarization and begin to find some solutions so that we can have actual conversations to move solutions forward.
Right. That's the only way to start to resolve some of these wicked problems. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that makes sense. So you were actually thinking about kind of expanding on your original article, and but the reality hit you that I could write all I want about these wonderful things that each person can do to help improve our communities. But until we learn to talk to each other, those little things, they'll have minor ripple effects, and we want big ripple effects. We want waves.
Exactly.
Oh, that's so cool. So when you're sitting in church and they make this announcement, do you remember where you were sitting?
I do. Yeah.
Can you describe that?
Yeah, I was kind of sitting in, the back, because I tend to do that, on the edge. And I just remember hearing about it. And I think that I instinctively knew that I needed to know this, because logically it didn't really make sense for me to take that much time out of my schedule and, everything. And it was vague enough, even just the title, it's hard to really know what that's about if you hadn't been exposed to it, which is interesting in itself, because I have a bachelor's degree in psychology and have studied management and organizational leadership and personal development for 20 plus years. And I was kind of a little baffled, like, how have I not heard of this theory before now? Right. Uh-huh. And so I was definitely curious.
So was your daughter sitting next to you?
She was, and she was interested in taking it as well, but she ended up, not making the commitment to take the class, but she was definitely interested also.
So I'm asking you this depth of questions about this moment in your time. This is like a pivot point for you, because I know that feeling when something a light bulb goes on. And I don't believe in an on-off switch. I believe in dimmer switches, that there's something subconsciously brewing before the light actually comes on full bright and your conscious mind chooses to accept it. And so I'm imagining you sitting in that room, your daughter sitting next to you. You probably weren't all that excited to be there in the first place, because it's not something you normally did, but you knew somehow that you were drawn to be sitting there next to your daughter at this moment. Even at that moment, you can look back now and definitely know. Yeah. But even at that moment, you had some inkling of it. Your dimmer switch was starting to come on. Did you talk to anyone right after that or during? Did you elbow your daughter, or... Because I'll do that sometimes. I'll knock somebody next to me and go, "Did you hear that?"
Yeah, I definitely did that. And, it was clear that it related to my topic. Obviously looking back now, it's like, oh, that was definitely a pivotal moment. And I would say I had a lot of those moments in writing this book. It was a very interesting, almost kind of co-creative process, because I would get stuck in an area and I would there were times where I was very frustrated in this project and writing the book and thinking, why am I doing this? It's taking so much of my time. I'm exhausted and, I'm just stuck. And then I would learn about something or I would have some experience. It's like, oh, well, that needs to be in the book,
Yes.
So it was actually, I did an interview with another podcaster who has a podcast called Intuitive Queens, where we really, spent the whole episode talking about that kind of co-creative, intuitive process that I went through as part of writing this book. And it was fascinating. I would say that it really helped me grow as a person, just going through that process, because there is so much of that just kind of surrendering to the process and not trying to control and micromanage. That's a lot of my background as a manager, and leading change is, taking charge and handling things. And the book process was really different. In fact, Elizabeth Gilbert has this quote that I often cite from her book, Big Magic, where she says that your creation is not your baby, you're its baby. And I really felt that with this book. Obviously you create a book and you have something tangible that you can hold in your hand, but the transformation that happens to you personally as a result of that is just amazing.
That is a fantastic quote. That just gave me chills, because I think about that in terms of all self-actualization, that I am the baby, the creative or being created soul as a result of my interactions with my global community.
Absolutely. And that also aligns with the theory that I talk about in the book, Spiral Dynamics, and Clare W. Graves's work, which basically tells us that we are a result of our life conditions. And that is what propels us forward, is our life conditions become more and more complex. And so we have to adapt in order to navigate those more complex waters. And so our life conditions change us and make us a different person.
Right. Well, definitely. I don't know anyone that could disagree that we are a product of our environment, and that the way that we think and the way that we move through the world is really dependent on what we've experienced in our past. It's the only way that you can explain any kind of interaction that a human being has with the world around them. I thought about this a lot when I was working with some college students. On Saturday morning, I did a leadership and storytelling workshop with a bunch of college students. Fun. And there were about 50 people in the room. It was really an outstanding group. It gave me, as you said, it gave you hope. This kind of interaction with young adults just gives me a lot of hope. And many of them already have kids, and they're working and they're going to school. And one of the things that one young woman said was that she had a conversation with her grandmother, and her grandmother said, "Your past is not your future. Your past doesn't define you." And that's my tagline. That's the thing that I say all the time, which is your stories don't define you, but how you tell them will. And I think that's part of why I had to reach out to you right away after reading the book, was that this is so complementary, these themes, these ideas that your environment has definitely shaped you and how you perceive the world. But that doesn't mean that that's the end.
Oh, exactly. And a lot of times, I think people who have been through a lot of struggle or trauma, that means their life conditions have been complex. And a lot of times that actually propels them forward even more. Because they've been able to move through those experiences. So, and I agree with you completely. I actually just had this conversation with a friend of mine last week about how it's so interesting that the way you frame your life is how you view yourself and how you view the world. We had to do this exercise where we each had 5 minutes, and we had to tell our history. But we had to do it in the third person. So we had to say, she grew up in Montana, and tell the story that way. And so it's so interesting how it changes your perspective. And we both realized at the end, it'd be interesting to go back and look at how we told our story and look at certain points, like, could we reframe that and tell that story differently about our past? And it would change our perspective about, who we are, essentially.
Yes, you can, and you do. That's the coaching I do, is I help people find those stories and reframe them and tell them in a way that makes more sense for who they are today.
Oh, I love that. That's so amazing and so needed today, too. I talk a little bit in the book about the importance of telling a story and creating a new story, essentially, too, as a country, because we've had so many different changes and we no longer share this common story because so many things have changed. And so I feel like storytelling is just critically important as we move forward.
It is. That was a big part of your book that kind of startled me. It was one of those, that does explain a lot, that fear of change and that fear that we're losing our identity somehow, because that is a very real and frightening thing, to lose your identity. It's why Jews still exist. It's because there's this, you're compelled to have an identity. It's part of our human nature, is to need and desire an identity in a community. And I thought about that a lot, how our whole Christopher Columbus story has shifted. And what I realized as you were just saying that is that we still have a great national story.
Yeah.
You just have to acknowledge that it's not all positive, or that there are multiple heroes in this story, and that some of the people we thought were heroes are actually villains. And that's okay. We love seeing that in movies, right? Yeah. So if we can frame it so that people understand that sometimes the people we thought were heroes were actually villains, and some of the people we thought were villains are actually heroes, it makes it more complicated, but it also makes it more accessible, I think.
I agree. And it gives us perspective too. It just helps us realize that not everything is the way that it seems. Sometimes if we look at things from a different perspective, we see different angles and aspects of that. So yeah, I think it's a good practice.
Yes, definitely. So tell me about the first time as you're writing this book and you're going through, I love the second half even more than the first half, because I'm all about application. I'm a very practical person. Yeah. People think because of the work that I do that I'm more on the touchy-feely side, but I'm not. I am definitely more on the practical side. So I loved the second half because it really gave me some ideas, practical ideas of how to apply what I was seeing in the world around me. Whether I agreed with everything that was in each layer didn't matter at that point. What mattered was the observation of where people were coming from and the fact that they are products of their environment, their upbringing. So that was powerful. The second half, the application. So now you're writing this book, you're probably practicing some of it so that you can make sure it works. It's kind of like you're not going to put a recipe in a cookbook that you haven't tried cooking yet.
Yeah.
So tell me about the first time you had that, oh yeah, right. Yes, that is exactly right. I'm sure you have a few of those.
Oh, definitely. And I'm glad you're saying that you felt like that was really helpful, because that was kind of the key impetus for writing this book too, was to create that practical application. I wanted to give people tangible things that they could do, because I love studying the theory, but I'm like you, I want to be able to actually apply it. And so I guess one example that I would share is I got to teach a short workshop to an organization here in Portland called Conscious Capitalism. And they get together with different meetings. And so I gave an overview about wicked problems and polarization and polarities, how we have polarities in the world. We have polarities everywhere. It's just a naturally occurring things. Just as simple as, do we change or do we not change, right? That's a polarity. It's, from one side of the scale to the other side. And so I gave a talk about polarities and polarity mapping, which is one of the tools that I included in the book. And so I actually took them through this exercise about a furniture company. And so I said, In the example, there's this furniture company that wants to implement sustainable business practices, but this particular example, it was going to cost them significantly more because they were going to have to replace their equipment. And so I had them go through that exercise. And so the polarity mapping basically has you look at, it's a 4-quadrant map, and it has you look at the benefits of changing, the benefits of not changing, the cons for changing, and the cons for not changing, essentially. And so I had the group complete this map. And of course, going into that, many of them really related to one side or the other. Yes, they should change, or no, they shouldn't change. And so they had this wonderful dialogue and completed this polarity mapping process. And so the interesting thing is at the end, so I said, okay, so how many of you started off with, feeling strongly about one side or the other? And everybody raised their hand. And then I said, at the end, do you still have that same view? And there were very few hands that went up. And so I asked for feedback, and just going through that process of actually looking at the benefits of changing, but the benefits of staying the same, because there are certainly, benefits to tradition and doing things that are proven, all of those sorts of things, is really helpful. And so what the participants came back and said was that it helped them understand the value of the other perspective. And so it really starts to train you to look at, okay, I really feel this way. The person across the table from me really feels this way, and I disagree with them. But this is a structured process where you can start to look at the merits of their perspective, because there's always some merit in someone else's perspective, even if it's not the same as yours. And so actually going through that process of having the discussion and mapping it out, it really helped people see the merits for both sides. And what they found, and what you find through this process, is that the solution is somewhere in the middle. And so it's not necessarily completely change or completely not change. The solutions are somewhere in the middle. It's a paradox. It's multiple things are right at the same time. And so, I believe that those skills are what are going to be needed for leaders in the future, is to be able to understand these different perspectives, map these polarities, and come up with these new solutions that are somewhere in the middle that are going to propel us forward.
I love that. So I'm imagining, again, let's go into a little more depth about the story itself. Right afterward, did you feel successful? Like immediately afterward, or were you kind of, I don't know if that worked the way I wanted it to?
No, I was so excited because it worked so clearly. And the people in the room, I think, were actually surprised, because this is a very simple exercise that you could do in any work meeting. You could do it with your spouse. You could do it anywhere. It's a very simple process. And it's so simple, I think, that it's easy to dismiss it. But when you actually go through it, you're like, oh, there were some good points from the other perspective that I hadn't considered. And once I considered those, it shifted my opinion a little bit. And so it's a great tool for bringing people together who have opposing views, or if you're just wanting to really manage a situation without, making a mistake, because we all have those blind spots that we don't see. And so this helps us identify those blind spots and create new solutions.
Right. Yeah, that makes so much sense. And it's not necessarily what I would call consensus. It's definitely more compromise. And I don't really believe in consensus. I've worked as a facilitator for groups across the state with the university system. And I came to the conclusion that there's no such thing as consensus. But there is compromise, and there is finding the best solution, even if it's right. And it's not a right or wrong. Wow, that's excellent. So what was the first thing that happened after you finished? Did somebody immediately come up to you, and what happened then?
They did. And so immediately there were people who were saying, oh, I need to use this in my workplace for this, challenge. And so there were a lot of questions about, how to get access to the tool and how to use the tool and, how to kind of get started using it in their own company. And so that was really rewarding also, just to see that people were excited to begin applying this tool in their workplace.
Did any one comment kind of float to the top for you where you look back now and that's the one that you remember most vividly?
I don't know about one specific comment, but just hearing from people that it helped them to shift their opinion a little bit and to incorporate other perspectives, and really kind of the surprise that people had that it had that effect, right? Because sometimes we go into something thinking that we're right and we're not going to necessarily change our mind because we know we're right?
Right.
And then just being able to incorporate aspects of another person's perspective can be really helpful.
Yes, definitely.
And I think you made a great point about consensus. We think that we have to have consensus and that we have to convince other people that we're right, or they want to convince us that they're right. But really, those solutions are really somewhere in the middle. And it is that compromise and doing something totally different and being open to that possibility that maybe we're not 100% right and that there's something that we can learn from somebody even with a very different perspective to come up with this, a new solution. And I talk about this a little bit in the book, but I think it's so important. There's a quote in the book that says, basically, we can't move this country forward when half of the people are deplorable. And I would say that you could say deplorable or snowflakes or whatever the term is that realizing we can't all move together when we are villainizing part of our population, and that we need to start to look at those perspectives and find ways that we can work together.
Mm. And it's not necessarily common ground specifically. It's really more about common value.
Yeah. And I think that we can find that common value even with people with different perspectives. I talk a little bit about superordinate goals, which are big overarching goals that people will aspire to regardless of their perspective. And, I think this example of coronavirus is giving us a superordinate goal, right? We all have a desire not to get sick and for our family members not to get sick and to be able to stay healthy. And so we have superordinate goals that are emerging to combat this, epidemic, essentially, worldwide epidemic. So.
Yeah, but the next question is, how do we keep, again, from vilifying people who have it or shared it by accident? It's not like, I think one of the most important things is to, when you see something like that happening, understanding that it wasn't intentional.
Right.
And I thought about that a lot, even in recent years as a long married person, that when something goes wrong, like I'm navigating and I say to turn and it's the wrong turn because my app isn't working properly or whatever. And, the temptation is to be angry with me if my spouse is driving, to be like, and to demonstrate that disdain and frustration. But then that next moment of thinking, wait a minute, it wasn't intentional. We're just going to take another turn. It's not a big deal.
Yeah.
Getting sick is a big deal. And especially because people with immune systems that are compromised and seniors are at risk of, we're talking fatality here. So it is a big deal. At the same time, we have to recognize that people aren't doing this intentionally. And that most people, their intention is to keep it to themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah. And assuming the best of other people and that they're doing the best that they can. I think that that's something that, we can all kind of aspire to doing.
Yes, exactly. This has been such a great conversation. I know that we have many more in our future because there's so much connected here that we can contribute, I think, together and then in a broader sense in terms of helping people take that step back. One of the ways that I described it to a friend after reading the book was that the most important aspect of understanding the spiral dynamics, the levels at which people understand the world around them or see the world around them, whether they understand is a totally different concept. But the most important aspect of this is to not judge. I mean, that is, as far as I was concerned, when I read that book and I said, I was trying to figure out where I was in the levels and the layers of the dynamics. I was trying to figure out where I was without taking any kind of assessment and trying to be honest with myself and truly self-reflective to say, where am I on this? And I realized what really matters is to not judge no matter where somebody else is in that, because you don't know what they experienced. You don't know what their life was like before this moment. And as we said at the very beginning of this conversation, we are shaped by our environment, by what we've seen, what we've experienced, and how we've perceived it as a result of the people around us, our parents, the teachers and other role models that we've had, positive and negative. And so I just want to thank you particularly for that bright spot, that whole idea of stepping back from judgment.
Yeah, absolutely. That was definitely a takeaway from me, for me as well, when I learned about the theory and started to understand it. And I talk a little bit about that in the book, is starting to move from thinking about wicked people in the world to realizing that we have wicked problems. And it's not necessarily the people, even if they disagree with us or have a totally different perspective, that they're not essentially bad, that they just have, a different view of the world. They're looking through a different lens, is what you kind of come to learn when you understand spiral dynamics. And you're right, it's based on their life conditions. And if I had grown up in those life conditions, my perspective might be much closer to theirs. And so just realizing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So do you have any other stories you'd like to share as a result of having written this book? Any just really bright spots after writing it or during writing it, beside getting the opportunity to meet and talk with Dr. Beck, that you have said, you mentioned him over and over again, even more than Claire Graves, who was the designer of spiral dynamics?
Yeah, I might just mention that this process, and so I would encourage people too, like if they feel called to kind of step into some type of, creative process that really pulls them out of their comfort zone, to take that chance, because just all of the connections and contacts and amazing friends that I've made all over the world through this process, like those were things that I would not have expected starting down this path. And that piece has been amazing. You mentioned Andy in Australia. I've met Andy just through social media because the person who wrote the foreword for my book is from Australia, and his name is Steve McDonald. He's a futurist who's been studying spiral dynamics and the work of Clare W. Graves since the 90s, essentially, and is an expert in this area. But he's connected me to so many people, and there's so many people out there trying to create positive change that it's been just gives me a lot of hope and optimism. And then being able to facilitate some of those connections between those people too has really been a fun process. So I have a Facebook group called Agents for Change, and so we have a lot of great conversations in there. And there's been partnerships and projects that have already emerged out of that group. So that's been one of the fun things, I think.
I love that. The whole, it gives me hope. It starting to see so many people that are making that effort to be a positive force for change. I agree. And it's part of why I was so excited to reach out to you, was because I knew that our networks will now connect. I immediately thought of my friend Carol Campos, whose podcast is The Divine Breadcrumb.
Oh,
which is similar to your intuitive. What was that? Intuitive
Queens.
Intuitive Queens. Yes, that kind of startled me. Intuitive Queens. But yeah, Divine Breadcrumb is Carol Campos, and she also has that sense of connectedness and I hate to call it surrender. And I've heard that used a that term to surrender to that creative place or to the universe's messages or whatever, because surrender sounds so passive. But it's really being open to whatever opportunities land in your lap and really assessing and discerning the value of those opportunities. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Monica. This has been such a treat. And for our listeners, I will have links to purchase Monica's book, The Change Code, and I will find a link to her Huffington Post article from 2012. Is that right?
2014.
2014. You know, what's funny about that is that I just interviewed somebody, Stephen Megling, in Richmond, Virginia, whose article in the Elephant Journal in 2016 is still getting a ton of views and comments. And so I love that these older, timeless, continuing relevance of articles are still making their way across our community platforms. So I'll have a link to that, and I will encourage you to connect with her on LinkedIn and maybe even check out her Facebook group. So thank you, Monica. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. And thanks for all that you're doing too. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will. If you're planning an event or company retreat and want to bring in a memorable, entertaining, and highly practical speaker as your keynote speaker or workshop facilitator, please visit us at elkinsconsulting.com to learn how we can help and provide a memorable keynote or breakout session. Thank you. I look forward to hearing from you.
Now listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away?